Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this presentation today. My name's Rosie Austin and I'm a trainee clinical psychologist. I undertook this service evaluation whilst I was on placement with the St Helens and Knowsley Community Specialist Rehab Service, and we evaluated the need for psychoeducation across the network for patients with an acquired brain injury and their families or carers. Unfortunately, I'm not able to attend the event today, but Cara, my supervisor, is there and she's able to answer any questions that you may have at the end. So as a starting point, I'm going to speak a bit about the background and rationale for the project. As you will have all experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a reduced capacity for face-to-face appointments. And this highlighted a need within our service and more widely across the network to find alternative ways to provide information and support to people. This was discussed in one of the Network Quality Improvement Group meetings, and a need for patient education, particularly around cognition and sleep, was raised. So as a result, the trainee before me, Erin, developed a series of psychoeducational videos on a range of different topics, including fatigue, memory difficulties, anxiety and low mood. These were made available online on the Cheshire and Merseyside Rehabilitation Network website, as this video format meant that they were more easily accessible to patients and their family members at home. This received really positive feedback from staff, patients and family members, who all agreed that this had been really useful, and they asked for additional resources to be developed. So before developing any additional resources, it also felt really important to consider the evidence base around psychoeducation for individuals and their families following a brain injury. In 2022, NICE guidelines on rehabilitation following traumatic injury were released, and these stipulated that programmes should include educational materials to help people to understand the nature of their injuries, to promote self-care and to prepare them for the long-term nature of rehabilitation. Similarly, in a review of clinical practice guidelines for rehabilitation by Lee et al., all reviewed standards recommended patient education to facilitate self-awareness and self-management. They said that this could happen in an individualised or a group format, and the educational content should include simple information about the brain and the effects of a brain injury, types of rehabilitation interventions, and ideas about possible short and longer term outcomes. Some limited qualitative research has also been carried out to explore patient and family perspectives on brain injury rehab. In a study by Graf et al., patients described insufficient information about their condition being a barrier to rehabilitation. They said that they felt a lack of preparedness for the difficulties that they noticed when they returned home, which included changes in cognition and mood. And similarly, in a study that carried out focus groups with patients with an ABI and their families, a key theme emerged around the need for information and education. These participants said that they were often given insufficient information about their injuries, which made it difficult to feel like they could make good decisions, or else they were given too much information that this became unhelpful. So I guess taken together, the key messages from this literature suggest that patients and their families need this information to facilitate their understanding of the brain injury and to enable them to prepare themselves for each step of their rehab journey. So for this reason, a network quality improvement group specifically for patient education was set up, and this is made up of clinical psychologists, trainees and assistant psychologists from across the network, including inpatient, extended rehab and community settings. We all agreed that before developing any new materials, it felt really important to understand the needs of the patients and the family members and carers that we are supporting. This is in line with the key objectives set out by the Cheshire and Merseyside Rehabilitation Network around patient-focused services and ensuring that patient voice shapes our quality improvement work. It's also consistent with one of the key lines of inquiry set out by the Care Quality Commission, which relates to ensuring that patients are involved with their healthcare and encouraged to share their views and experiences. So the key aims of the service evaluation were firstly to understand patient and families or carers' knowledge of neuropsychological rehabilitation, to gain perspectives on the types of information needed and the preferred format for this, and to understand how information had been helpful or unhelpful to people in the past. A survey was developed in conjunction with my supervisor and the input from members of the Network Quality Improvement Group for Patient Education. This was then reviewed by the Walton Centre's Clinical Audit Group and by the Patient Information Panel, and it received approval to go ahead. The survey included a section where participants were asked to provide ratings of their knowledge in various areas of neurorehabilitation, such as attention and processing, memory, changes to emotions, changes in behaviour, insight, executive functioning, and changes in social skills. Scores range from 1, I don't know anything about this, to 5, I know a lot about this. And there's also the option for participants to select that this wasn't applicable to them. Following this, 4 open-ended questions were asked to prompt participants for more in-depth responses. And then finally they were asked about how they would like to access information in the future. So in terms of how this was carried out, members of the group for patient education approached patients and their family members or carers and invited them to participate in the survey. So this may have been people that they were currently working with on a ward or individuals that they were seeing within their homes with their families. 24 people completed the survey, 11 of these were patients and 13 were family members or carers. So what did the results show? First, I'm going to talk about the results in relation to Aim 1, which was to understand patient and family members or carers' existing knowledge of different neuropsychology topics. Mean knowledge score was calculated across all topics and was found to be 2.6. So this figure is half of the maximum scaled score of 5, indicating that participants felt that they generally knew something about the topics, though not a substantial amount. This suggests that there may be a need for more resources relating to neurorehabilitation in general. Areas that participants collectively felt they knew most about included sleep, changes to emotion, and impact on family. Areas that participants felt they knew the least about included other mental health difficulties, chronic pain, libido and sexual functioning, and changes to identity and role. We wanted to establish whether there were differences between the 2 different types of respondents, so between patients and family members. On average, patients and family members were found to rate their knowledge similarly, suggesting that access to information is similar across groups. Where differences did occur, these tended to be most pronounced when family members rated their knowledge substantially higher than patients, for example in the cases of memory, thinking, impact on family, and other mental health difficulties. This might be due to the family member's ability to access more in-depth detailed resources compared to the person that they're supporting, or due to their increased insight into the range of difficulties in these areas. Alternatively, it may be reflective of the pressure that families are under in supporting their loved one with this rehabilitation process, meaning that they're really keen to understand as much as they can so that they know how best to help. There were differences in the areas that patients and family members felt most and least knowledgeable in. So families felt most knowledgeable in impact on family and about sleep and fatigue, whereas patients felt most knowledgeable in mental capacity and decision making and substance misuse. In terms of least knowledgeable, families chose chronic pain, libido and sexual functioning, and patients chose other mental health difficulties and also libido and sexual functioning. Patient scores were also differentiated into inpatient and community to establish whether current setting impacted on the results. Patients within community settings did rate their knowledge slightly more highly than patients within inpatient settings, which could be seen to be expected, given that patients within the community are generally further along their rehabilitation journey and therefore have been exposed to a greater amount of information from a wider range of sources. Next will be the results in relation to the second aim, which was to gain perspectives on types of information needed and preferred format. This felt like an important question to ask, as we recognise that areas rated low by participants within the survey might not necessarily correspond to a need for additional information in that area. Areas that were mentioned the most by participants were social skills, executive functioning, sleep and attention. So these are the areas that participants said that they would like more information on. This was quite interesting, as sleep and attention were both areas that were rated quite highly in the rating scale responses. In comparison, knowledge of identity and role and libido and sexual functioning were both rated as quite low in the scale responses. However, they each only received one mention for this group in the open-ended questions. Preferred format for future information was mixed. 7 participants indicated that they would like information to be available online, 6 via an online group, 4 in a leaflet form, 3 on an app. 2 participants added a category for in-person, indicating that they receive information most effectively when it's explained to them during a conversation. And then finally, the results in relation to Aim 3, to understand how information had been helpful or unhelpful to participants in the past. Here, themes emerged around specific information that had been useful, including information about brain repair and relaxation techniques. Methods of delivery of information were also discussed, such as the use of analogies or involving service users and their carers in their recovery. Other themes are more closely related to the types of messages that were helpful to receive when you're going through a process of rehabilitation or supporting a family member through this, such as acceptance, patience, and positivity. This suggests that it's not only information relating to specific changes following an ABI that's important to patients and their families, but also that which provides insight into the longitudinal nature of recovery and inspires a sense of hope for the future. Only 12 respondents answered the question about whether information had been unhelpful in the past, and 10 of these answered no. Other responses indicated that complex information had not been helpful and that repeating information had aided understanding. From these results, a number of recommendations have been made in relation to psychoeducation within the network. Firstly, psychoeducation around neurorehabilitation needs to be more easily accessed by patients and their families or carers. This doesn't necessarily mean that new materials need to be developed on each area, but that individuals are signposted to existing resources on a more routine basis. It might be useful to consider collating a bank of links to resources, which can then be given to patients and their families. Secondly, psychoeducation needs to be developed on social skills, executive functioning, sleep and fatigue, and attention and processing, as these were highlighted as key topics that participants would like to know more about. It might also be worth considering the other areas in which participants rated their knowledge as poor, including other mental health difficulties, chronic pain, libido and sexual functioning, and changes to role and identity, though these were not specifically named as priorities. Future information should be made available online. A psychoeducation group could also be considered, or else a group could be set up with a different topic each week, and patients and their family members could join those that feel the most relevant. In this way, there would also be potential for the presentations to be recorded so that a bank of resources can be collated. If this was to happen, then the information would also be more easily accessible for people with a visual impairment. Patients and their families or carers should be consulted on the development of any new materials to ensure that these are easily understood and not overly complex. Finally, information should be provided about the long-term nature of recovery, as this will enable service users and their families to have a realistic idea about what to expect, whilst also instilling hope and a positive outlook. Stories from others who have been through this process could be incorporated into materials for this purpose. The service evaluation had a number of limitations. Only 24 participants completed the survey, which means that it's not necessarily representative of all patients and their family members across the network. It was noted that response rate declined as participants moved through the qualitative sections of the survey. However, respondent type was not found to be a predictor of whether the open-ended questions were completed, suggesting that the reason was not because the questions were too complex for individuals with a brain injury. Instead, perhaps it was because there were too many questions or that participants didn't feel that the questions were relevant. The fact that the survey required participants to provide written answers may have also introduced bias in the recruitment procedure. For example, staff might have been more inclined to approach participants who were more able to communicate or that had sufficient fine motor skills to hold a pen. In some instances, staff also assisted patients to complete the survey, recording their responses to questions. In these cases, responses are likely to be more detailed as staff were able to explore the questions and prompt for additional comments. Also, it may have meant that participants were less able to be honest in their responses and were more likely to give desirable answers. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.